The morning felt wrong before the sun even touched the rooftops. The kind of cold that settles on a town when a truth is trying to push its way out of the dark. You could almost hear it breathing in the quiet. Like a warning someone whispered generations ago and hoped would finally reach the right ears. In that stillness, Dr. Elijah Ward sat alone at his small kitchen table, staring at an old weathered notebook that carried more weight than any textbook he had ever taught from. Elijah wasn't the kind of man who filled a room with noise. His strength lived in the way he paused before speaking, in the way his eyes sharpened when history didn't match the stories America liked to tell. He had spent years teaching African American history at a community college, watching students sit with the same heavy questions. Why does the world flinch at black brilliance? Why does black ambition trigger punishment instead of praise? Why does truth feel dangerous only when it comes from a black voice? Elijah carried those questions too. Tucked behind a calm that took years to build, the notebook once belonged to his grandfather, Langston Ward, a sharecropper who survived the late 60s by learning to see everything and speak almost nothing. Langston wrote down the threats that hid behind polite smiles, the nights he walked his children home with one hand in his pocket around a knife, the deals that promised fairness but delivered the same old trap. He listed the judges who shook hands with police chiefs behind closed doors, the banks that pretended to follow rules while quietly shutting black families out, and the schools that taught obedience instead of opportunity. Langston didn't write to complain. He wrote because he knew one day someone would need the truth. Elijah had read those pages more times than he could count, but this morning, his fingertips brushed something he had never felt before. A thin line of dried glue along the inside of the back cover. He eased the paper free and found a single folded sheet hidden there. His chest tightened. His hands trembled. When he opened it, the air in the room seemed to lean in and listen. The page held a story about a political group from the 1950s, a group that studied fear the way others studied law. They designed policies that looked harmless at first glance, but were built to choke every path black families tried to take upward. Policies that restricted schools, limited financial mobility, and pushed hopelessness like a quiet poison. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was strategy. Elijah read the page again, slower this time, as if the words might catch fire if he blinked too hard. For years he had taught about systems, about patterns, about the long shadow of America's past, but this was proof written by a man who lived inside the machinery, a man who watched injustice being designed piece by piece. He leaned back, breath unsteady, knowing this discovery would change everything. This wasn't just history. It was intent. My name is Simmons, and this is Chronicles of Black. If you're here, make sure you subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be heard. And before we go any deeper, drop your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever felt a truth pressing on your spirit, waiting for the right moment to be spoken? Elijah stayed at that table long after the morning shifted toward daylight. He knew he was holding something dangerous, not because it was false, but because it was real. The kind of real that rewrites what people think they know. The kind of real that powerful folks never wanted spoken aloud. He closed the notebook gently, like he was laying a hand on a wound that had finally stopped bleeding, and he understood what his grandfather had left for him. Not a story, not a warning, a responsibility, a weight he could no longer pretend he didn't feel. Elijah turned the fragile page over, and for a moment he didn't breathe. The ink had faded, but the truth was still sharp enough to cut. His grandfather wrote about a courthouse basement, a place where the walls always sweated and the lights barely flickered, as if even the building felt uneasy about what happened down there. That was where certain white officials met after dark, slipping through side doors so nobody would question why men with that much power needed secrecy. They gathered at a long wooden table and laid out their plans with the same calm a doctor might use while explaining a routine procedure. Except what they were cutting open wasn't a body. It was a future. Langston explained how he once hid behind a supply closet door, close enough to hear their boots scrape the floor. Two sheriff deputies bragged about a tactic they believed was brilliant. One laughed as he talked about reducing funding to black schools so slowly no one could trace the decline. Make it look like numbers. Folks don't argue with numbers, he said, and the others chuckled like it was clever. Then they talked about increasing police presence in black neighborhoods, not to protect anyone but to control them. They spoke about it the way children talk about moving pieces on a board. No humanity in their voices, no shame. Langston wrote about the moment one of those sheriffs leaned back in his chair with a grin that froze him in place. The man described black children as if they were animals that needed fences instead of futures. Langston felt every word like a threat pressed against his throat. He didn't move, he didn't cough, he didn't dare let the air in his lungs escape. because he knew if they found him listening, that basement would become the last room he ever saw. Elijah felt the heat rise in his face as he read, a slow burn, not from surprise, but from recognition. He had seen the consequences of those plans every day in his classroom. Young black students walking in with brilliance that teachers before him failed to nourish. Kids who talked quietly because the world taught them that raising their voice could cost them more than detention. Students who asked him why opportunities seemed to slip through their fingers even when they did everything right. He used to struggle to explain it gently. Now he knew he didn't have to soften anything. The truth was right there in his hands. Langston's notes revealed how racism shifts when it feels threatened. When laws changed, racism learned to hide. It learned to dress itself in polite language and official documents. It moved from overt rules to zoning lines that divided communities. It turned school funding into a maze where wealth always found its way back to the same neighborhoods. It coded its intentions behind phrases like underperformance and discipline concerns, making the system sound neutral even as it crushed black potential. Nothing was accidental. Nothing was coincidence. Elijah read about how bank officers were instructed to approve white families quickly while black families were told to bring more papers, answer more questions, wait more months. He read about school boards that quietly closed black schools and relocated students across town, hoping to break community roots. He saw how every tactic was framed as policy, data, or safety. But Langston described it plainly. It was control. The more Elijah absorbed, the heavier his chest became. He taught history, yet this was something deeper. This was a blueprint of how power learns to protect itself. His grandfather had risked everything to write down what others were too afraid to say aloud. These weren't rumors. They weren't exaggerated stories passed down in anger. They were documented decisions made by men who felt no guilt, and Langston wrote them down because he knew one day someone would need proof. The room felt smaller as Elijah turned the page again. He thought of every time someone told him racism was exaggerated, every time someone claimed black people were imagining barriers, every time someone insisted the system was fair if people just worked harder. He thought of the students who internalized those lies and blamed themselves for the roadblocks placed in front of them long before they were born. He whispered into the quiet, almost talking to his grandfather through time. You saw everything they said didn't exist. The ache in his chest deepened, because the truth wasn't new. It was simply hidden. And Elijah finally understood why Langston kept writing even when the world tried to silence him. Someone needed to know the truth before it disappeared. Someone needed to see the strategy behind the struggle. Someone needed to be brave enough to read it, and braver still to speak it. Elijah closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of every word. What he held wasn't just history. It was the map of a system that had shaped generations. A map left behind by a man who lived through the consequences and wrote them down so his grandson wouldn't spend his life thinking the pain was a mystery. Elijah exhaled slowly, one hand still resting on the notebook. Black people were never imagining the forces against them. The forces were real. They were intentional. And they were documented by a quiet sharecropper who understood that truth is only dangerous when it stays hidden. Elijah knew what came next wouldn't be easy. But he also knew he couldn't walk away. Not now. Not after learning how power had hidden its hand for so long. Hoping no one would ever pick up the evidence, Langston risked his life to leave behind. The first sign something had shifted came the next morning, when Elijah walked into the faculty office and felt conversations stop before he even reached his desk. People who normally nodded barely looked up. A secretary who always greeted him with warmth avoided his eyes. He didn't need anyone to spell it out. Someone had told the wrong person that he was preparing to publish Langston Ward's hidden chapter. By noon, the rumors were moving faster than he could. A colleague slipped into his office and closed the door without sitting down. She spoke quietly, almost whispering, telling him that some town officials were asking questions about him. They wanted to know what he planned to release. They wanted to know whether it threatened community stability. Elijah heard the strain in her voice. Good people always sounded like that when fear pushed them into silence. Before he could respond, an email popped onto his screen from the department chair. It was short, cold, and final. Due to adjustments in enrollment, his largest class was being cut for the semester. Elijah stared at the message, knowing full well the waitlist for that course was always long. Cut wasn't the right word. It was stripped out within an hour. Another notification appeared. His email permissions were temporarily restricted pending content review. He leaned back, feeling the pressure settle between his ribs. They weren't even pretending to hide it. Every lever of control the institution had over him was suddenly being pulled at once. Not enough to fire him outright, just enough to choke his voice. That afternoon, he checked his faculty mailbox and found an envelope with no name. Inside was a piece of paper torn from a spiral notebook that carried only 4 words. "Leave this alone now." The handwriting looked rushed, like someone scared of being recognized even through ink. He folded it quietly and put it in his pocket. The next day brought a second envelope. This one wasn't a warning. It was a threat. The message was crude, full of anger, full of the kind of venom people hide until they feel protected by anonymity. Elijah held it between 2 fingers, feeling the weight of every black professor, researcher, or writer who had been told the same thing in different ways. Speak softly. Stay grateful. Don't question the world that tolerates you. He threw the letter into his drawer and locked it. That evening, he sat at his mother's kitchen table drinking tea that had long gone cold. She watched him with the same steady gaze she used when he was a boy, trying to hide his fear behind silence. "What happened?" she asked gently. Elijah told her everything. The emails, the cancelled class, the notes, the feeling that the walls around him were slowly closing in. She never interrupted. She listened the way only a mother who carries her own scars can listen. Her face calm, her hands still. When he finished, she took a breath and leaned back in her chair. "Baby, I've lived long enough to know that truth has a cost. Sometimes a heavy one, but lying has a heavier one. You hear me?" He nodded slowly, his throat tight. She continued, her voice quiet but firm. "They don't fear your grandfather's words. They fear what those words say about them. They fear the mirror, and mirrors make people dangerous." Elijah stared at the steam rising faintly from her cup. "What if I'm putting you in danger too?" "You're not," she replied. "The danger came long before you picked up that notebook. You're just refusing to close your eyes to it." Her words sat inside him long after he drove home. The night felt heavier, but clearer. Fear pressed down on him, steady and familiar. A weight black scholars knew well. Every achievement questioned, every accomplishment treated like a mistake waiting to happen. Every truth he tried to teach turned into an accusation by people who believed history only mattered when it made them comfortable. Elijah sat on the edge of his bed with the notebook in his lap. He saw his grandfather's handwriting, shaky in some places, but unbroken. Langston had written through nights when knocking on the wrong door could end a life. He had written knowing no one would protect him. He had written because he refused to let the truth disappear. Elijah felt that responsibility settling onto his shoulders. His grandfather died believing black knowledge was something the world would always try to erase. Elijah couldn't be the one who proved him right. He looked toward the window where the streetlights painted faint shapes against the dark. For a moment, he wondered what would happen if he stopped. If he walked away, if he told the world he had misread the page or misunderstood the notes. He knew exactly what would happen. His email would be restored. His class would return. The threats would quiet down. The college would pretend none of this had ever happened. He also knew he would never forgive himself. Elijah closed the notebook gently. The fear was still there, thick, sharp, real, but something else had risen beneath it. A slow, steady courage that came from knowing the truth was bigger than the danger. He whispered into the quiet room, almost to the memory of Langston Ward. "I won't bury your voice." Then he turned off the light, fully aware that tomorrow would bring more pressure, more backlash, more attempts to silence him. But he had already made his choice. The truth was coming out, and he was done being afraid of who that would upset. Elijah Ward knew there would never be a perfect moment to reveal the truth, only the moment he chose to stop being afraid of it. So late one night, with only the desk lamp glowing and his grandfather's notebook beside him, he clicked record. There were no dramatic lights, no scripted pauses, just a black scholar, speaking plainly, fearlessly, and with the clarity of a man who had finally stepped into his purpose. Elijah *, my grandfather wrote what he saw. I'm sharing what he risked his life to preserve. This is not an accusation, this is a record. He walked listeners through the basement meetings, the tactics, the language of power wearing a legal smile. Then he drew the line straight into the present. How school budgets map perfectly onto old red lines. How public safety spending swells while classrooms crumble. How entire communities are called underperforming when they were engineered to fail. Elijah didn't raise his voice once. He didn't need to. The truth was loud enough. When he uploaded the lecture, he expected quiet, maybe a few comments, maybe nothing at all. He did not expect a nation to stop scrolling. By morning, the video had crossed state lines. By noon, it crossed borders. By night, it had crossed into living rooms that had never spoken honestly about race. For black viewers, it felt like someone had finally put language to the weight they'd been carrying for generations. For white viewers, it felt like staring into a mirror they had spent their whole lives avoiding. Some wrote him messages of gratitude, others wrote accusations, a few cried on camera, a few called him a liar, and one politician went on national television and demanded the lecture be taken down, calling it dangerous. But the truth had already slipped past their control. It had become something living, moving through classrooms, churches, group chats, and dinner tables. Communities began reading Langston Ward's notebook aloud. Black teachers held circles where students finally said, "I knew I wasn't imagining it." Parents organized reading groups. Historians requested copies. And Elijah Ward, once a quiet professor tucked inside a small-town college, became a spark in a growing fire of black scholarship that refused to shrink, refused to soften, refused to apologize. The truth had been hidden in a basement for decades. Now it was being taught in classrooms, discussed in barbershops, shared in protests, carried in the hands of a nation finally ready to confront itself. What was once buried was now heard, and there was no turning back. The truth had spread farther than Elijah ever imagined. And so did the danger. It started with whispers on campus. Then came the cold stares from people who once shook his hand. Then the emails, anonymous, venomous, threats dressed in misspelled rage, warnings wrapped in cruelty. But the day Elijah walked out to the parking lot and found his car scratched, windows shattered, and a slur carved into the paint, the air inside his chest collapsed up. When someone posted his home address online, the fear became real. A white supremacist group marched down his street one night, carrying torches like a ghost of the past, wearing modern clothes. They shouted his name. They dared him to come outside. Police cars watched from a distance but didn't move. And maybe the worst cut wasn't from enemies, but from friends. People he trusted began to back away. Some said he went too far. Some said he was dividing the town. Some simply stopped responding. The backlash was not just loud, it was personal. One night, as the weight pressed down on him like 1,000 hands, Elijah sat alone beside the notebook that started it all. His breathing was shallow, his hands trembling, and somewhere in the silence, he asked a question even the bravest people whisper to themselves in their darkest hour. Elijah, broken, barely audible, "Did I make a mistake?" He opened the notebook, and there, near the back, written in faded pencil, were the words his grandfather scribbled decades ago, words Elijah had read before, but never truly needed until now. Langston's note, soft, ghost-like, unwavering. "Tell the truth, even when your voice shakes." Elijah traced the handwriting with the tips of his fingers. He imagined Langston Ward, a young black man hiding in courthouse shadows, listening for footsteps that could end his life. Still writing, still documenting, still believing someone, someday, would be brave enough to carry the truth forward. Langston died with the truth trapped in his notebook. Elijah refused to die that way, because telling the truth is not free. It costs safety. It costs relationships. It costs the innocence of believing the world is fair. But silence costs identity. Silence costs dignity. Silence is how whole generations disappear without a trace. Elijah stood up from that desk, tears drying on his cheeks, and made a promise to his grandfather, to his community, and to himself. He would not be erased. He would not be quiet. He would not return the truth to the shadows that tried to bury it, no matter the cost. The storm did not break Elijah. If anything, it cleared the sky. Weeks passed, but the truth refused to fade. It sparked conversations in barbershops, in church basements, in classrooms, in kitchens, where elders had long stopped believing anyone cared to listen. Langston Ward's words traveled farther than he ever could. His notebook, once hidden behind glue and fear, became a lighthouse guiding a new generation toward understanding. And then came the night of the community gathering. Hundreds filled the room. Teachers, activists, elders who carried stories etched into their bones. Young people who had never heard someone speak truth without apology. The air felt alive, charged with memory and possibility. Elijah stepped onto the stage, the notebook held gently at his side. He didn't smile. He didn't raise his voice. He simply breathed, and began. Elijah, steady, powerful in his calm. This truth was never meant to destroy anyone. It was meant to free us from silence, from confusion, from the lies we were forced to swallow. He looked out at the audience faces, reflecting hope, anger, relief, pride. For generations, they were never afraid of black power. They were afraid of black clarity. Because once we understand the game, we stop playing by their rules. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Elijah opened the notebook, running his thumb over his grandfather's handwriting. This is not just history, it's a compass. It shows us where we've been, and it reminds us where we're going. My grandfather wrote these words in fear, so that we could read them in freedom. A silence filled the space-heavy, sacred dot, and then applause. Soft at first, then thunderous, not just for Elijah, but for every ancestor who held truth in their hands and prayed it would one day reach someone brave enough to speak it. The journey comes full circle. The hidden chapter becomes a beacon, Elijah becomes a bridge, and the truth once buried under dust, fear, and the weight of whitewashed history now stands tall in the open air. Because the truth doesn't die when powerful men try to hide it. It doesn't fade when systems try to bury it. It waits, it endures, it survives. In notebooks, in memories, in whispers, in classrooms, in communities refusing to be silent. And in the end, the truth outlives them all. The story closes not with fear, but with clarity, not with anger, but with strength, not with pain, but with purpose. Langston Ward wrote the truth. Elijah Ward carried it, and now the world hears it. Fade out.